Welcome to the debate. Today we're examining a central question drawn from the vast and really complex history of the National Hockey League. We're looking at what the primary catalyst is for the evolution and the competitive integrity of the sport.
Right. Are the greatest leaps forward achieved through player agency? The deliberate breaking of institutional monopolies?
Exactly. Or, on the flip side, is it systemic constraints, the rigid rules and structures of the league that truly force on-ice adaptation, tactical innovation, and deep-seated loyalty? We are grounding our discussion today in the historical records of the NHL, stretching all the way from the highly restrictive Original Six era,
Very restrictive.
through the heavily expanded leagues of the 1970s and into the highly modernized landscape of the early 2000s. And, well, my position on this is that the league evolves best and reaches its truest competitive form when players actually assert their individual agency and defy corrupt or stagnant institutional control.
And my position is the exact opposite. I firmly believe the sport reaches its absolute highest pinnacle when players and teams operate within strict systemic constraints. It is the structure itself that forces tactical innovation and cultivates the long-term loyalty that defines greatness.
Okay, well, if we really want to understand why player agency is the true engine of progress here, we have to look closely at what the league looked like before players had any real power. The history of the NHL is, at its core, a story of labor dynamics, overcoming exploitation.
Sure. People love to romanticize the Original Six era, right? Which ran from 1942 to 1967. They call it the golden age of pure hockey. But if you look at the structural realities of that time, it wasn't a golden age at all. It was a stagnant, deeply exploitative monopoly. I mean, have you ever really thought about the implications of the 50-mile territorial rule?
You mean the rule that gave teams exclusive rights to players within a 50-mile radius of their home arena?
Exactly. It effectively gave the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs a geographical monopoly on the absolute richest prospect pools in North America.
Mm-hmm.
If you were a kid growing up anywhere near Toronto, you were essentially the property of the Maple Leafs by default. There was no open market, there was no draft as we know it today, and meanwhile, the owners exercised absolute dictatorial control over the entire sport. Just look at James E. Norris. He owned the Detroit Red Wings, but he also had massive financial control over the Chicago Blackhawks, the New York Rangers, and the Boston Bruins.
Right, he essentially bankrolled half the league.
He was the bank. It was a literal monopoly. He was treating the NHL like a house league. Player pensions were kept completely secret, and labor conditions were dictated by a handful of men in a boardroom. Progress in this sport, or really any industry for that matter, only occurs when that kind of absolute control is shattered by the workers, the players defying the system.
Look, I won't deny the harsh labor realities of the Original Six era. The secret pensions and the territorial advantages were incredibly unfair to the individual. I'm with you on that. But we are talking about the primary catalyst for the evolution of the sport itself. What happens on the ice?
Right.
And if you look at the product on the ice, greatness is forged by constraints, not by circumventing them. That 25-season period of structural stability created unparalleled, concentrated talent pools.
But that concentration was completely artificial.
Artificial or not, when you force the absolute best hockey players on the planet into a crucible of just 6 rosters, you elevate the standard of play to a level that simply cannot exist in a highly fluid, expansion-heavy environment. Every single night, the absolute best were playing against the absolute best. You couldn't take a shift off. True evolution is on-ice adaptation. That monopoly, as draconian as it was behind the scenes, established the baseline for what modern tactical hockey had to become, just to survive.
I have to disagree that it was a crucible of greatness. A crucible implies a fair test. This system was fundamentally compromised by a lack of competitive balance. The Montreal Canadiens missed the playoffs exactly one time between 1943 and 1967. One time. 3 teams, Montreal, Toronto, and Detroit, hoarded 24 of the 25 Stanley Cups awarded during that span. That isn't a crucible. That is the result of a rigged system. And what happened when players actually tried to push back against the system to create a fairer environment?
I know exactly where you're going with this. You're going to bring up Ted Lindsay.
I have to bring up Ted Lindsay. He was a 4-time Stanley Cup champion. He was the driving force for the Detroit Red Wings. And what did management do? They shipped him off to the last-place Chicago Blackhawks simply because he tried to form a players' union in 1957. Absolute systemic control didn't breed innovation. It created an environment where legendary players were treated as disposable commodities the second they questioned the monopoly.
The treatment of Ted Lindsay is a dark chapter, certainly. But let's look at what happened when the league finally broke that monopoly. In 1967, the NHL expanded. They doubled in size, adding 6 brand new teams. And what was the immediate result? It heavily diluted the talent pool.
Well, initially, yes.
For years, the expansion teams were essentially second-class citizens on the ice. They simply couldn't compete with the legacy teams. In fact, it wasn't until the 1973-74 season that an expansion team finally managed to win a Stanley Cup.
The Philadelphia Flyers.
Exactly. The Philadelphia Flyers. They defeated the Boston Bruins in the finals, becoming the first non-original 6 team to win the Cup since 1935. It took 7 years for an expansion franchise to rise to the level of the original 6 standard. And here is the key point I want to make. The Flyers didn't win by dismantling the league structure or breaking the rules. They won by adapting to the immense physical and tactical pressure that the original 6 teams had established. They evolved the game from within the system.
Okay, but let's pull back and look at the big picture of the Philadelphia Flyers as a franchise, because their ultimate success is tied perfectly into the necessity of player defiance. Fast forward from the 70s to 1991. The Flyers eventually revitalized their franchise by acquiring Eric Lindros, and Lindros stands as the ultimate modern pioneer for player agency. He recognized very early on that blindly submitting to an institutional system could severely damage a player's career.
He certainly made that clear in junior hockey.
He did. He flat out refused to play for the Sault Ste. Marie Greyhounds in junior hockey because he didn't like the setup. But the defining moment was the 1991 NHL draft. The Quebec Nordiques had the first overall pick. They had finished dead last in the NHL for 3 consecutive years. They were an organization with a profound lack of winning spirit. They were poorly managed, and Lindros, an 18-year-old kid, looks at this antiquated capitalist structure where a team could just claim you, and he says, "No, I refuse to play for you."
The sheer audacity of a teenager doing that to an entire professional league is still staggering to think about today.
It really is. Marcel Aubuth, the Nordiques owner, tried to publicly force his hand. He practically tried to force the jersey over Lindros' head on the draft stage, but Lindros held firm. He sat out. He went and played for the Canadian national team, won an Olympic silver medal in 1992, and essentially forced Quebec to trade him. And that defiance was incredibly healthy for the sport.
Healthy. It caused a massive logistical nightmare for the league.
Look at the result. The trade package that Quebec got in return from Philadelphia was astronomical. Peter Forsberg, Ron Hextall, Mike Ritchie, multiple draft picks, and $15 million. Do you know what $15 million meant in 1992? That single act of labor empowerment redistributed talent across the league. It paradoxically built a dynasty in Colorado after the Nordiques relocated there, and it gave Philadelphia a franchise cornerstone. Lindros goes to Philly and wins the Hart Trophy, the league's MVP award, in 1995. By asserting his individual agency, Lindros created competitive parity that a stagnant draft system was completely failing to produce.
I hear what you're saying about Lindros breaking the mold, and the trade undeniably altered the landscape of the NHL. But look at the actual cost of that absolute insistence on individual agency. When a player places their own individual will above the systemic constraints of the team and the league, it inevitably leads to profound friction. Lindros' career, while brilliant, was categorized by constant conflict with management.
Conflict isn't inherently bad if the management is wrong.
But it derailed his prime. Let's talk about Bobby Clarke. Clarke was the general manager of the Flyers at the time. He was a player from those 1970s Flyers teams we just talked about. He was the embodiment of the old-school, tough guy, systemic mindset. You play through the pain, you do what the team says. Lindros, representing modern player empowerment, clashed directly with that. This culminated tragically in the late 1990s over the handling of Lindros's concussions. Clark ultimately stripped Lindros of his captaincy, and Lindros ended up sitting out the entire 2010 season because of a contract dispute.
Over a qualifying offer.
Right? For those who aren't familiar, a qualifying offer is basically a mandatory baseline contract a team has to offer a restricted free agent to keep their rights. Lindros refused it. He demanded a trade to Toronto. Philadelphia wouldn't grant it, so he just sat at home for a year. He lost a prime year of his Hall of Fame career to a battle of wills. This is what happens when you prioritize the individual over the system. Now, contrast that friction with Martin Brodeur.
I had a feeling we were going to end up in New Jersey.
You can't talk about NHL Evolution without talking about Brodeur. Drafted in 1990, just 1 year before Lindros. Brodeur didn't demand a trade. He didn't fight the system. He stayed within the New Jersey Devils organization for 21 years. And the Devils played a very specific, highly rigid defensive system called the neutral zone trap.
Which, for the casual listener, basically means clogging up the middle of the ice so the opposing team can't skate through with any speed. It was incredibly effective, but a lot of people thought it was incredibly boring to watch.
Boring or not, Brodeur didn't fight it. He became its ultimate manifestation. Operating within those strictures, he led them to 3 Stanley Cups in 1995, 2000, and 2003. He provided 21 seasons of unprecedented franchise stability. He won 4 Vezina trophies as the league's best goaltender, routinely playing 70-plus games a season. His legacy wasn't built on boardroom holdouts or demanding trades. It was built on a deep, enduring commitment to mastering the systemic constraints placed upon him.
It's an interesting comparison, but you're giving the system way too much credit here. Let's go back to Lindros for a second, because even with the concussions and the friction with Bobby Clarke, we see how Lindros's individual agency forced the sport to evolve on the ice and off the ice. Lindros centered a forward line known as the Legion of Doom. These were massive guys. Lindros was 6'4", 230 pounds, skating incredibly fast and hitting incredibly hard. The league's systemic constraints had absolutely no answer for a player of that size and skill. Opposing teams had to adapt tactically just to survive him.
They certainly had to change their defensive schemes, I'll give you that.
Exactly. Look at the 1997 Stanley Cup Finals between the Flyers and the Detroit Red Wings. The Red Wings coach was Scotty Bowman, arguably the smartest tactical mind in hockey history. Bowman realized he couldn't just send out his traditional bruising defensemen to out-hit the Legion of Doom. It was impossible. So he innovated. He deployed finesse-oriented, incredibly smart puck-moving defensemen like Nicklas Lidstrom and Larry Murphy. Instead of hitting Lindros, they outpositioned him and moved the puck away from him. Lindros's sheer physical dominance forced a massive tactical evolution toward puck possession and finesse defense.
That is true, but that is an example of the system, in this case Scotty Bowman's tactical structure, adapting to solve a problem.
But the catalyst was the individual. And furthermore, look at off the ice. Lindros's tragic history with concussions, especially that devastating hit by Scott Stevens in Game 7 of the 2000 Eastern Conference Finals, forced the league into a necessary reckoning with player safety. His defiance regarding his own medical treatment, when he pushed back against team trainers who were failing to diagnose his brain injuries properly, was the spark for the modern medical protocols we see today. The institutional system did not protect Eric Lindros. His individual pushback against that system forced it to change for the better.
I understand the impact of Lindros's situation, and it certainly highlighted the flaws in medical protocols at the time. But we should also acknowledge that institutional systems often adapt not just because a player is being defiant, but because the structure itself has a solemn responsibility to react to reality. Systemic adaptation is often a structural necessity, not just a reaction to a rebel.
What do you mean by that?
Look at the 2001-02 season. The tragic death of a 13-year-old fan, Brittany Cecil, who was struck by a deflected puck in the stands. It was a horrific, heartbreaking moment for the sport. And how did the league respond? They implemented mandatory protective netting above the glass behind the goals in every single arena. That was a profound, league-wide systemic change. It wasn't enacted because a player demanded a trade or because someone held out on a contract. It was the institution recognizing a crisis and structurally adapting to protect people. Systems are capable of necessary evolution on their own when faced with outside forces,
That is a fair point about institutional responsibility in the face of tragedy. But if we pivot back to how the game is played on the ice, the gameplay itself, I still maintain that the players are the ultimate drivers of change.
But even on the ice, the most profound changes happen when a player masters the existing rules so completely that the league is forced to adapt. You mentioned how Lindros forced Scotty Bowman to change his defense. Well, Martin Brodeur forced the NHL to rewrite its actual rulebook.
You're talking about the trapezoid?
Yes, the Brodeur rule. Brodeur's puck handling ability was so elite, so fundamentally game-changing, that the NHL had to step in after the 2004-05 lockout. Traditionally, a team would try to get past the neutral zone trap by using a dump-in. For anyone listening who doesn't know, a dump-in is when you just hit the puck deep into the offensive zone and chase after it to regain possession. It's called the forecheck.
Right. You dump it into the corner and send your wingers flying in to go smash the defenseman and get the puck back.
Exactly. But Brodeur ruined that entire strategy. Whenever a team dumped the puck in, Brodeur would simply skate out of his crease, stop the puck behind the net, and immediately fire an incredibly accurate pass right back up the ice to his forwards. Former executive Brian Burke joked that Brodeur was destroying the forecheck by turning the game into a tennis match. The opposing team hits it in, Brodeur volleys it right back out. He was so magnificent within the rules that the NHL literally had to paint a restricted area, a trapezoid, behind the net. If a goalie plays the puck outside that trapezoid, it's a penalty. It was basically an anti-Brodeur zone. Precisely. He mastered the constraints of his position so thoroughly that the constraints themselves had to change to restore competitive balance. Evolution didn't require him to rebel against his employer. It didn't require him to hold out or cause friction. It simply required him to be perfect within the system until the system broke around him.
Look, if we pull back and look at the big picture here, I think the history of the sport proves that dismantling monopolies is the painful but absolutely necessary engine of progress. Whether we are talking about breaking the Norris family's financial stranglehold on the original six to finally allow expansion teams like the Flyers to flourish, or Eric Lindros shattering the restrictive nature of the draft to assert a player's right to determine his own fate, progress requires defiance. Lindros' refusal to accept a stagnant, poorly run situation in Quebec redistributed wealth and talent across the league. His pushback against team medical staffs initiated a vital evolution in player safety. Institutional structures naturally tend toward exploitation and stagnation. They want to keep things exactly as they are. It is only the rebels, the players, who leverage their unique agency to break the mold, who elevate the sport toward greater fairness and higher levels of dynamic competition.
And to summarize my perspective, greatness is inextricably born from constraints. The intense crucible of the original Six era, despite its glaring labor flaws, forged a baseline of exceptional talent and intense tactical rivalries that defined the modern game. When expansion arrived, it was teams adapting tactically to those high standards that moved the sport forward. Ultimately, true evolution is found on the ice, not in contract negotiations or boardroom holdouts. Martin Brodeur stands as the defining example of this. By remaining deeply loyal to his franchise, avoiding the friction of ego, and embracing the defensive system in New Jersey, he forced a structural rule change through sheer unparalleled mastery of his position. The sport is elevated by those who respect the system enough to push it to its absolute limits from the inside.
You know, despite our differing viewpoints, I think we have reached a genuine point of convergence today. It seems clear to me that the perpetual tension between a player's individual will, their agency, their physical dominance, their demand for fair treatment, and the league's institutional structure is the defining dynamic of the sport's history.
I completely agree with that. Both forces are constantly pushing and pulling against each other. The individual tests the boundaries, the system reacts, and then the system establishes new boundaries for the next generation to test. That tension is what makes the history of the sport so endlessly fascinating.
Indeed, there is always more to explore in how these forces interact. We will leave it to the listener to decide whether the sport is ultimately elevated by the rebels who break the mold or the loyalists who master the system. Thank you for joining us for this rigorous exchange of ideas.